everyone. Welcome to the Summer Blitz. Just wanted to let you know that we are recording this session because we have a lot of folks that will watch it after the fact. And I'm going to turn over to Beth to start with introductions.
All right, great. So I'm Beth Santer. I'm the Executive Director of Special Education and Early Intervention Services for Wayne Risa, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Sandra Brock, who is the Instruction Assessment and MTSS person at Wayne Risa. And there's two reasons why Sandra and I wanted to do this presentation for everybody. And one is in terms of having a special ed and gen ed lens. So Sandra and I work very collaboratively at RISA. We do believe that special ed and gen ed should always be at the table together making decisions. But we also have a bit of history. Sandra and I also worked together at a local where we did the same thing. And so we thought that it would be a powerful presentation to represent both worlds.
So, good afternoon, and thank you for being here again. As Beth mentioned, I'm Sandra Brock from RISA, support MTSS all around Wayne County, and we're just thrilled to have you here. So, we hope that you leave with some tools that are helpful and some knowledge that's good for your journey. Okay, so a couple quick housekeeping things. There's a QR code there which should allow you to sign in to the actual presentation. So if you don't mind, just taking your phone and taking that picture and signing in. If something happens, you're not able to stay with us the entire time. This is being recorded, so we will be able to send this out to folks. And we're just going to jump right in. So if you could put in the chat or even just show us on camera, we're going to ask some questions. And we're going to do a fist to 5. So a fist is, I have no idea, I've never heard this term before. And a 5 is, I know everything about this topic, I could run a session on it. Okay, so we're going to do a fist to 5 around these two questions. So number 1, how many of you are very familiar with MTSS processes and systems? Okay, I see some. Okay. Okay, and that's what we see when we go around the county. We see some folks that are, 1s, 2s. We see some folks that are 5s. And then we have a second question. So again, a fist to 5. How many of you have a district system or a school, maybe you're, a K-8 or K-12, where the elementary MTSS process is really ingrained, but secondary needs a little TLC. It needs a little bit more development. Okay. I mean, that's what we see around the county also is at the secondary level, it's a little bit more tricky because elementary kids are self-contained. They're usually within, a classroom teacher's class throughout the day. So if they need extended time, MTSS fits a little bit more perfectly into that area. In secondary, the bell rings and, they're on to their next class at the high school. So it looks a little bit different. So we are going to start with a brief video. If you're not aware, Katie Novak and associates are really on the forefront of MTSS processes and guidance at a national level. And so we're going to watch her video, and this is a great video to show staff, teachers, principals, MTSS teams, paraprofessionals, because it really synthesizes in an organized manner what MTSS is. So we're going to go ahead and show that.
Right now, I am enjoying the best chocolate cake. And the thing about this chocolate cake that makes it so wonderful is the multi-layers of chocolatey goodness. So let me tell you how this cake is very similar to a multi-tiered system of support. When we talk about creating a continuum of supports for learners, I want to make one thing really clear, okay? If I had a cake right now, I would frost it to say, supplement, not supplant. Because if I'm ordering a layer cake, I don't just want the second layer or the third layer. There's no point in ordering a layer cake if I can't have all of the layers. And in our classrooms today, we need to make sure that every single student has access to best first instruction in tier 1 grade level classrooms. That is the bottom, that is the foundation for the cake. And some students we recognize will need more than that to be successful. And that is a beautiful part of variability. And so we want to layer on services that students need. So all of our students are general education students first. And some students benefit from special education services or behavioral support or support socially and emotionally. And we have to make sure that we create a system that supports these layers and ensures that students get more and not instead of. Too often we think about tiers as locations. We use language like tier 2 students or special education students as though they belong somewhere different. If we are to create inclusive and equitable classrooms, everyone needs that bottom layer of support. And when they need it, we have to build systems that ensure that every single learner gets what they need academically, behaviorally, and socially and emotionally. Now, to do this, we have to zoom out and recognize the importance of building teacher competency, of making sure that we have robust implementation drivers like curriculum and scheduling and technology. And also, this requires incredible instructional leadership and family and community engagement. But with all those ingredients, we can make a beautiful layer cake that truly honors all of our students. And you know what? I want you to think about that the next time you have a piece of cake.
All right. So just something to think about. We will go back to this point throughout the presentation. All students are tier 1. If a student is in intervention or getting some support, it never really should impact tier 1 instruction, tier 1 classroom time, because all of our students belong to us. So we will again come back to that, but that's a really important point in the video and something that we'll talk about in our presentation.
So just continuing on Dr. Novak, but also Dr. Brock's point, when we look at MTSS and special education, I mean, again, first we want to be partners, not silos. And that's kind of why I did that introduction in the beginning about how Dr. Brock and I do a lot of collaborative work together. We've done that at the local and at the ISD level because it's really important because they are all our students in special education. We always hear our gen ed students first. And so we want to make sure that we're modeling that by making sure our departments work together. But also, what's important about this is that we want to make sure that we are not doing what Dr. Novak talked about with supplanting. So we want to make sure that MTSS is for all students. And so there's two traps that a lot of times will happen. And one hopefully is not in existence anymore. I used to hear it a lot when MTSS first came out, and that is that MTSS is a pathway to special education. It used to be, and I was at a local as well when there was RTI and then it became MTSS. And there was that thought that you had to go through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 before you got a special education evaluation. In other words, you kind of had to have these steps that led to that special ed eval. But that's not the case. These tiers are flexible, they are free flowing, and special education works alongside MTSS. It isn't a pathway to special education. So that's the first misconception that, like I said, I don't hear as often, but we do want to make sure we say it. The second one I do sometimes see at some of our local districts, and that's that once you have special education, that MTSS no longer applies or you don't have a right to MTSS anymore. And that is not true at all. Special education provides specially designed instruction. And that doesn't take the place of intervention. Now, it can work alongside it, and there can be some overlap, but our special education students should not be getting less services when they have the most complex learning needs. And so one thing we are going to talk about in terms of what it looks like in practice, there's some examples there that all of you will have access to the slide deck. So we're not going to read everything off the slide. But one thing I do want to mention is those intervention blocks. So when your elementary buildings have intervention blocks or secondary, That's not the time. If you're doing tier one or a tiered intervention, reading intervention in the classroom, that's not the time for Johnny to go see the speech therapist to work on his R's or S's. We want to make sure that our special education students are getting that same tiered intervention and are seeing their ancillary services for that specially designed instruction at another time, especially when it's unrelated to the intervention that's happening. So all of you have seen this pyramid before, I'm sure, and it's that tiered framework. So universal tier one of the reasons why Dr. Brock and I are talking a lot about tier one is because it covers 80 to 85% of your students. So that's a large majority of your students are at tier one, meaning that tier one interventions help them move forward in their learning. And tier two is about 20%, and tier three is about 5%. So we really want to make sure we're stressing tier one because that's where most of our students are. Now, sometimes what we see at local districts is that there's a lot of attention put towards tier two or tier three. And I get it because those are the students that are struggling. But just know that if all you're focusing on, or if most of your energy is focused on tier two or tier three, you can't tier two and tier three your kids back to tier one. Where the focus really needs to be is at that tier one. And so if you were to look at your data and do the numbers in your buildings and see that you have it's not necessarily exact, but if you have 40% tier two students instead of 20, then you really want to look at what is going on at tier one. And now I'm going to throw it to Dr. Brock because she's got a guidance doc that she's put together for districts.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. Thank you. So, when we talk about what is so important in tier one, it's really going to be a couple of things. Number one, that evidence-based, consistent resource. So, consistent resource from classroom to classroom, or if you're in a district, from school to school to teach the Common Core standards or to teach your standards. So, if you have a math class, for example, let's say at elementary, if it's Bridges in Mathematics or Everyday Math, making sure every single teacher is using that same resource. And why that's helpful is if you give an assessment and all kids are really struggling in second grade, for example, with perimeter, you can ascertain within that resource, maybe they're not teaching perimeter super well, and maybe we have to bring in something else to further teach the concept of perimeter. In an ELA class, it is equally as important, to make sure that the kids are using the same text, the same resource from classroom to classroom, from school to school, because when you pull that data, if it's benchmark assessment data, local data, you can see those areas where there are patterns that kids are not mastering. So strong tier one comes down to consistent instructional materials is pivotal. And then consistent instructional strategies. So making sure we're choosing those high impact strategies that we know work with students. Small group, academic vocabulary. Again, just itemizing, really identifying what those are and making sure that they are used from classroom to classroom, because the stronger our tier one is, the less our numbers really should be for tier two and tier three. I'm just going to touch on a couple other quick things. You'll see the My MTSS pinwheel on the left side of this document. My MTSS is a state organization. They have amazing webinars, community practice meetings, conferences. Some of them are free and online. So if you're a classroom teacher and it's hard to get away, it's just a great resource to know exists if you want to learn more and get more support with MTSS. Again, just making sure with tier two, it's happening within the classroom. We know that sometimes pullout is necessary and targeted intervention is necessary at tier two, but making sure that small group and some tier two interventions happen within the classroom. Tier three, ideally it should be individual, one educator to one student, but we understand in this day and age with fund balances, that's very difficult to do. We have seen at the county sometimes one educator to two students, one educator to three. But bottom line is you want to make sure tier three is happening systemically on a regular basis. Progress monitoring is key, making sure that we're doing those dipsticks weekly, daily to see where kids are at, those exit tickets, and then making sure we're reading our assessments, pulling that data, making sure students and staff, I'm sorry, making sure that staff understand how to read the reports, and there's time built in where they can come together and review those reports to really ascertain how students are doing. Last but not least, the essential practice documents written at the state level. If you haven't seen these, they're great. And so we have the QR code here. They're just really well done and a great resource for ELA and mathematics. Okay.
Okay. So now as when we talk about MTSS, you need to have, if you're going to have an MTSS team, you need MTSS team members. And so the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about what would be kind of the recommended team that should be coming together. And so you're going to want that building administrator. It's probably more likely that that would happen at an elementary. At secondary, it might be assistant principal, or sometimes it's that special education supervisor or director that might be acting as that administrator. Ideally, though, it would be a gen ed and a special ed administrator if possible. Not everybody has an MTSS coordinator, but a lot of districts will have an instructional coach. And if you don't have one, then you don't have one. But if you do, that is definitely somebody that you would want at that table, because that person is going to bring that lens of those interventions and that specially designed, not instruction like a special educator, but specially designed interventions that they do with all students. You wanted to have a gen ed teacher. They're going to be bringing that lens of that classroom lens to it. And then on the next slide, special ed staff. This is something that obviously coming from special education, I'm going to be stressing because it isn't always the case. Sometimes I've seen MTSS teams where a special education staff will be quote unquote invited when there's an issue with the student or when there's a problem. But again, when we look at MTSS, it is a prevention type of framework. And so once you say to a special educator that, you know what, you don't need to come every week, just come when we have an issue with a student, now it's not MTSS anymore. Now it's more RTI, or that's where you're kind of, or a child study. So you want that special education person to be at those meetings. So if you have weekly MTSS meetings, that person should be there every week. And then you'll want an SEL, a mental health provider that is attending, because MTSS isn't just academics, it's also SEL and behavior. And then again, not everybody has an assessment coordinator, but you want somebody that knows data. So when you have this collection of data, whether that's in a Google Drive or Illuminate or whatever system you use, you want somebody to be able to interpret that, because in education, we take a lot of data, but we have to make sure that we put aside time. And we're going to talk about data digs further on as we go, where you get that time to analyze the data. But you also want to make sure, Sandra referred to it, that you have people that understand how to read these reports, because otherwise it's data that kind of hangs out there. It doesn't really attach to anything. Sometimes that instructional coach is also well versed in data.
Okay, so we talked a lot about, academics, non-negotiables, consistent resources, consistent instructional practices that work from classroom to classroom. We're also going to talk a little bit about social emotional and what that can look like from a tier one lens. So making sure we have those behavior expectations, building a community in the classroom. Some of the best teachers I've seen spend that first month, maybe more, of school or of the semester building those relationships with kids. Because when kids feel they can trust you and trust each other, it goes a long way. And there's that classroom community where if things get hard, they can turn to one another, or they feel comfortable coming to the staff or the paraprofessional in the room. So spending time building those classroom procedures and building relationships with kids, getting to know them. One of the best practices I saw is very simple. Teacher handed out index cards and wrote to kids, tell me 3 great things about you. And it was positive. Kids were writing positive things about themselves, really helping their self-esteem. And then the teacher got to know them, just read through them on her planning period, but got to individually know each of her kids. And then obviously with Cell, we're talking the whole child. So not only academics, but we're talking about are they coming to school regularly? How are they doing in their classes? And if you start seeing some of those, what we call early warning monitoring systems, where students, it's October and he or she has 6 absences. Well, that student should be flagged. I mean, why are we in October and the student is missing school? Is there something going on? Do we have to, be more engaging for that student at school? And that's really where, social workers and again, the relationship with classroom teachers can come into play because you want to find out what's going on because we want them at school, no matter the situation. So just making sure that we have those universal designs in place and also those indicators where if a student is struggling, maybe he or she has been in the counseling office a lot or in the main office, we have them flagged for a further look to take time to see how we can help them.
So the one thing I would just want to add on to what Sandra talked about is that first point where it said evidence-based curriculum. That's the other thing that you definitely want to work with your districts. And we get every district is in a different place when it comes to curriculum adoptions and what you're able to use. But ideally, you want again, we're focused very much on tier one. So for 80 to 85% and for all your students, you want to have evidence-based best practices, curriculum, all of that. Because if you're kind of grabbing things from this place and grabbing things from that place and it's not consistent in your building, then it's hard to argue that that really is tier one curriculum. That sounds more like differentiated instruction that we're kind of expecting everybody to have, if that makes sense. So when we go to this slide, universal screening, again, MTSS is preventative. So you want to get ahead. And we want to make sure that we're screening all students. It's not going to be just those that are referred. And we want to use those valid, reliable tools that match those grade levels. And when we talk about act-on results within a defined window, that's kind of what we were talking about before, where you have scheduled times. We used to call them data digs in our local district. Scheduled times where you are not just meeting, but where you are meeting to analyze the data. And you're analyzing the academic data and the SEL and behavioral data. So just to give you an idea of what that could look like. So when Sandra and I worked in a local, we had elementary buildings that were on trimesters. And the academic assessments had specific windows, or some of them had specific dates. And so we would do our SEL screener at the same time, the same window as the academic screeners. And then about 2 weeks after that window closed, we would set up a data dig. And if elementaries were on trimesters, we did 3 data digs because it lined up with their report card time, if that makes sense. And you want to do it about 2 weeks after you've done all of that assessment because you need time to get that data together so that it's ready to be analyzed.
Okay, so we're going to continue the conversation around database decision making. As Beth said, we have those windows a lot of times that are naturally set up if you use iReady or Renaissance or NWEA, PSAT. So we want to make sure that the data is pulled within a reasonable timeline so we can look at it and adjust instruction appropriately. The most important with data is that it has a place to go. We've seen districts do a MTSS handbook that really sets up the criteria. Vicksburg, which is linked in this PowerPoint, has an exceptional MTSS handbook, knowing that they're probably, years down the road. So just take baby steps writing the MTSS handbook. But it's a great example when you're looking for different pieces of MTSS to follow. So again, that is linked in here. And what's most important about the data is it is housed somewhere. So whether it is in a data system, on a Google Drive, You want the data accessible to everybody who is part of this process. Teachers need to see their data and understand their data. That criteria has to be really well ironed out. So, for example, if a student, let's say the benchmark RIT score on assessment is a 231, and the student is at a 201, and he or she has missed 4 or 5 days of school, and they're not doing well with their local academics. That is clear criteria that says, whoa, we got to take a look at this student. So making sure whatever the criteria is, whatever your school or district dictates, and it looks different in each grade level, that everyone's on the same page and that everybody can go again to a system, a Google site, a Google form or a Google sheet to really be on the same page of, okay, this student is flagged for tier two because of these criteria. So it's just very important.
So what comes with MTSS are those tiered interventions and tier one, tier two, tier three. So you want to make sure that you actually have a written list of what are your tier one supports, what are your tier two, what are your tier three. And um, Dr. Brock talked about the importance of a handbook, and that is true, especially in today's day and age where it's pretty rare for us to have teachers that are teaching in that same building for 30 years or in that same district for 30 years. We have staff changes. And so the way to onboard that new staff quickly and to get that support to kids is to make sure that you have it written down in a very thorough but simple fashion. So somebody that's new can pick it up and have a good understanding of how your district looks at MTSS. So if you look at the reason why we put tier one and tier two supports on this slide and not tier three is because tier one and tier two supports are going to be in that classroom. And so again, if you put tier one and tier two together, it was about 80 to 85%, and then it was about 15%. That's about 95% of your students are going to be in tier one or tier two. And so we don't want to have those kids coming out of the classroom unless they absolutely have to. So you can see some examples of tier one supports, and you can see you can do a lot of different things in tier one. And for tier two, that's where you're getting more into those specific interventions and small group interventions. But that still can be done in the classroom. And it doesn't have to be completely done by the classroom teacher. You can have special education, maybe resource room providers or speech or social work, depending on what the interventions are. Maybe they can do some push-in services. The main thing is that, like we talked about before, that whatever intervention anybody is providing in that classroom, that we're making sure that nobody is missing something, that they're all getting the same interventions, not the same specific to them, but if you're working on reading, then you're going to make sure that all the kids in that classroom are working on reading intervention. So we put this slide in. We do a lot of work at RISA with Hanover, and they had really nice information on these key features. And so this is really just information for you to have if you're going back to your district and you want to talk about what tier two and tier three look like. Now, again, it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but these are general best practice guidelines. And then same with this slide. These are the differences between tier two and tier three. And so again, that's just information for you to have in terms of what the difference is, but also for you to bring back to your buildings and districts if they're struggling with how to differentiate between these tiers.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into the dyslexia legislation, which is K-12, called PA 146. If you have not heard of PA 146 or the dyslexia legislation, is probably one of the biggest pieces of legislation recently that is, coming down, so to speak, and definitely districts are already working on this or should be if they are not. So when we talk about evidence-based tier one, materials, this is one of the first times that the state is saying by next fall, we still have some time, you have to use one of these materials. So it's a great opportunity for schools or districts to pilot materials. I really urge you not to make every teacher pilot. It's really a great practice to kind of tap your all-stars on the shoulder and see who voluntarily would like to pilot materials so that teachers have a voice and can make the best decision for their kids, choosing from the list. There's also a K-3 assessment list and a grades 4-12 assessment list. These lists have been updated. So they've been updated since they originally came out as late as this past July. So one of the most important links on this page, I'll just pull it up briefly, is the actual dyslexia page at the state level. They are constantly updating the documents that are here. If there's another vendor added to one of those lists that's approved, the list will be on this page. So I would definitely bookmark this page. Again, there's a lot more, I guess, direction for elementary folks because they have a list for you to choose from. And the idea is to pick one of those materials to explicitly teach the science, use the science of reading from classroom to classroom. So I would really urge you to dive into PA 146 if you have not already. There's also a grant that was possible, 35M. So a lot of districts did 35M. So they had money to pay for these curriculum items. So there's an FAQ there for you to look at. And what we typically find is this is housed within the work of principals or an instruction department. But again, it is so important if you're doing a pilot or if you have a committee that your special services or your special education partners are part of that team and have a voice. A lot of times these curriculums might even have an intervention material that couples. For example, in math, we have bridges in mathematics, bridges intervention, and your special education staff can pilot both of those so that a choice is made with general ed and special education faculty at the table.
And so one thing I want to bounce off of what Sandra was saying in the previous slide, she was talking about the importance of having special services be part of it, and that is absolutely true. And I would take that even one step further. So let's say your district is adopting Bridges Math at elementary, making sure that all of your resource room providers, your special education providers at elementary are trained right alongside those Gen Ed teachers in Bridges Math. And not just one representative that goes to the 2-day training and then is expected to train all the other resource teachers on a prep period. But every single one is actually at that training. It's very difficult to come up with specially designed instruction for math if you don't have a really good understanding of what the general instruction for math is. And so it really yields the best results when you're being inclusive with that training. So with this slide, we're talking about SEL, and I saw that Dawn had made a comment in our chat about the importance of building relationships was a point that was lifted at a previous summer blitz. And I'm happy to see that because we definitely affirm that. We used to, in our local district, say that SEL is not on the plate, it's the plate. It's the foundation that you build everything from. And it's not a supplement, it's a prerequisite. And I know on Dr. Brock's pinwheel that she showed on her guidance stack, I had read that one of the reasons why SEL wasn't a shape on the pinwheel is because it's not separate. It's embedded in all of those pieces. And so that's important to remember. So SEL is really non-negotiable. And we already talked about with universal screening that if you're doing academic screening, you want to make sure that you're also doing that SEL screening, and you're going to want to do it at the same time periods as you would your academic testing. We never did ask you at the very beginning how many of you were special ed and how many were gen ed, but I will also say when it comes to special ed and behavior, Whether you're in general ed or special education, we know that the first calls we get are usually students who are dysregulated. And so that's why also SEL is so important to make that part of our foundation. So the next few slides were just examples of SEL curriculums that are either evidence or research-based curriculums. There's some that we're very familiar with and others that maybe not so much. I want to bring your attention to one more slide, Sandra, that Prepare You and Flair by NAMI. And the only reason why I'm bringing these to your attention is because they're a little unique. So Prepare You is just for high school. It actually is one of the ones that Sandra and I work together at our local to get adopted. That doesn't mean we get a commission for saying that. We don't work for Prepare You. It just is that SEL curriculums for high school are not as common. So we used Second Step for pre-K through eighth, but Second Step didn't have a high school component, and Prepare You was for high school. And the other thing I want to mention, so we had put Prepare You, I worked with Sandra because she was really, your gen ed counterparts are really good at that curriculum and board adoption process of curriculums. And we had decided to work with our health teachers and embed Prepare You in health class. And there was a couple of reasons for that. And one is that the health standards align really nicely to SEL standards, but also health is a required class. And so we knew that every child that graduated from that high school would have exposure to the SEL curriculum in their health class. The other thing that we want to mention is that, and we talk a little bit about how elementary is different than secondary. It's a different animal. That sometimes, for instance, Prepare You says it has 15 units and lessons. Well, if your health class is a semester and you also have to cover some health standards, you're probably not going to be doing 15 lessons, and that's okay. What we did is, again, we worked with our health teachers. Teachers know their subject areas. And so they looked at the curriculum and they looked at their standards and they determined, I think it was maybe 5 units instead of the 15 that were the most important and salient to our students and aligned with the health standards too. We also brought in QPR, which is a suicide prevention training program to supplement that. That's outside of an SEL curriculum, but you can also layer on, is kind of my point. The other thing that's important to mention is that SEL curriculums can be kind of tricky in terms of the adoption in some communities and some districts. And so also know that SEL curriculums can be flexible that way too, that you may have 15 different units and maybe some would be more accepted or more salient to your student population than others. And sometimes you have to get off zero. So you may not be adopting all of it. You may be adopting some and then maybe layering on and adding. The one thing I would suggest is, again, if you're a special educator, knock on the door of that general education central office person, because again, because they have done health adoptions and health curriculum, they know the steps that are needed for a community to wrap their arms around something like this. So we were very transparent. You're going to want to make sure you get in front of that and make sure that your community is aware of that, what SEL curriculum you're using, what's the purpose for it, what's the why, what will be those units that you are teaching, where are you teaching them, and it may be something that you also offer that some units a parent may want to opt out. And that's okay too, if your district wants to go that route. So just finishing off this slide, Flair by NAMI is another one that I wanted to highlight. One, because it's free, but also this curriculum really targets 6th through 8th grade. And it has a lot of the character building that a lot of SEL curriculums have, but it also has 2 5-lesson units that are specifically on suicide prevention, but also specific information on mental health disorders. So it has information on anxiety, it has information on depression, psychosis, bipolar, as well as those other units on empathy and character building. Again, you might want to use Flair by NAMI for the character building, or maybe you want to use it for the character building units and anxiety and depression, because maybe the middle school that you work at, that's what you have the highest incidence of, and that's the kind of information that's the most supportive. That's okay. That's what's great about these curriculums is that you can cater them to use for your population. Um, the other thing that I would mention about that is making sure that, well, we talked about the transparency, but also these curriculums are designed so anybody can deliver them that is in education. So these can all be delivered from a gen ed teacher. So again, this is tier one. So gen ed teachers, these are designed so gen ed teachers can deliver them. Now, that being said, there are some units that your gen ed teachers may come to you and say, I'm not comfortable with talking about psychosis. I'm perfectly comfortable with talking about empathy, but not that. And what we did in our district is there were some units that we would have maybe the social worker come in and co-teach, or the counselor come in and support the teacher, or do that one unit. However you want to do it. Again, the point is that there's flexibility when you have these curriculums that can suit the needs of your district. Okay, so this slide, I'm not going to go in too much. Really, the important piece is that second column. I mean, all of the information is important, but I mean, we've gone through a lot of the things for that first column. The second column just gives some examples of screening tools, and they all have different costs that are associated with them. So again, you want to look into that before you adopt any. And there's other tools besides these. Many of these tools have pre-made SEL screeners, but they usually also have a feature where you can design your own SEL screener. So again, it has that flexibility so it can suit your district's needs.
So we're
So
going to
we
talk.
talked,
Oh, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry,
Go ahead.
Sandra. No, you're good.
So I know we talked at the beginning, a simple way that we've seen teachers build relationships within their classroom. So I'm going to give you a simple way to do that positive behavior supported at a building level. Good news postcards. They can be a good news postcard, a good news email, a good news phone call. And what we really targeted was every staff member, 2 per month. So bus drivers, the lunch team, the main office admin. Pick 2 students, it can be anybody, and just send good news home. And we couldn't believe the response we had. We had parents calling us very emotional that they had never received good news from school. So I just wanted to give you, a simple tactic that it is impactful and that goes a long way in being proactive.
Yeah, the other thing that I just want to mention is a lot of these behavioral supports are rooted in PBIS. So PBIS is that tier one expectation, and then specific supports can be layered on top of that. And then when you look at the next couple of slides, tier two and tier three, again, there's a lot on these slides, and we don't want to read every bullet point on the slide knowing you'll have access to that slide deck. We just wanted to make sure that you could utilize the slide deck as a resource. If you, again, need to learn yourself about what are those specific tier two, tier three behavioral interventions, but also if you're going back and you're talking to a school or a district about helping to design that system. So So we've talked about how elementary and secondary are really a different animal, and they are. I mean, secondary, you have that single teacher. Secondary, you have systems, and Sandra's going to talk about how a lot of it's based on scheduling. The one
Yeah,
thing
I
I will
think. Oh,
say
good.
The one thing I will say is that when I was a local director and I had an elementary and a secondary supervisor, and we would go present on MTSS, I can tell you that afterward, it was the secondary supervisor that got most of the questions because it is something that is so hard to implement.
And at the secondary level, it really has to be built into that master schedule. So whoever builds your master schedule, partnering with that special education department or department head when building is super important. Anytime we build in an intervention course and students are rostered to that course, you want to have multiple voices at the table. Sometimes we have teachers who maybe don't have a roster, but there's an understanding that 20 kids every second hour period are going to see he or she for math intervention. They'll check into their second hour and then they'll go get that targeted intervention. We just want to make sure our master schedule supports that because that's directly tied to attendance and FTE. So that's a really great model to build an intervention at the secondary level.
The one other thing that I want to mention with that is if your district decides to go the route of having specialty classes, make sure that you've really thought that through. And again, work with your Office of Instruction with that because are they going to be electives that are for credit? Because if so, there has to be certain standards that are met, and Office of Instruction is really good at that. Also, if you work on quarters, or I should say, if you work on semesters, and this is part of an intervention, then if if the class goes longer than your first data dig and you find that the student doesn't need the intervention anymore, what is your plan for that? Is that student exiting that class and then being put in a different elective, or are they staying in longer? I'm not saying this as a barrier. I'm saying this as a proactive way of thinking about it so that you just have those answers before those situations come up. So with common pitfalls, we've talked about some. We definitely don't want to treat it as a referral process. We talked about how we have a lot of data, but without action, then what really was the point of taking that data if it's just floating out there? We want to make sure that we are having those data digs, we're triangulating the data, and then looking at it and analyzing it so that we can have some action tied to it. Um, Fidelity gaps and follow through. So MTSS has a fidelity tool that you can use at elementary and secondary. It is very reading heavy, so we did have to tweak it at our secondary buildings because our secondary buildings, it was more forward facing SEL than at elementary. And so we wanted to make sure that our fidelity tool reflected that. So you can tweak it, but I do think it's important for you to have a fidelity tool so you can look at what gaps you need to fill from year to year. Um, Making sure again, tier one, tier one, tier one. Now, one thing I do want to say is that we've talked about the danger if tier two or tier three numbers are too high, that you want to look at tier one. But also remember, an unintended consequence or outcome of having a really good MTSS system is don't forget your child find obligation if you are a special ed provider. So, for instance, if you have a student that's been on tier three interventions and they're making progress, but not significant progress for 2 years, don't forget that child might have a disability. And so you don't want to do MTSS so well that you forget that you do have a child find obligation that gets triggered. And that's more an art than a science. It's just something to keep in mind. And then we talked a lot about not operating in silos. We definitely work better when we work together.
So these are just reflections, questions for your team. If you have an MTSS team or a group that regularly meets, just good kind of questions to ask one another to ascertain where you are at. And then our last slide are really resources. So these are, videos, rubrics, comprehensive framework documents that can really help you kind of plan those MTSS systems. Again, having gen ed and special education at the table is really important. So making sure that when you have those meetings, we have resources, we have clear agendas, clear minutes, and action steps. So we've had our meeting, we've done our planning. Who is now responsible for doing what? So when you meet the next time, you know where you left things off. So these are, again, just resources to help you get there. And this is our last slide. We have a quick video clip we want to show you, and we just want to say thank you for all you do. It is not easy being an educator. Sometimes it's actually quite challenging, but we do it because they need us and because they bring smiles to our faces every day. And if it's not us, then who's going to do this job? So thank you for all that you do, and we'll leave you with this video.
They got teach by another teacher, and a teacher got teach by another one. So all kinds of teachers teach other teachers how to teach kids.
When you think you've got the job down, that's the time to be nervous.
As teachers, we have to learn how to adapt.
Children learn different ways. They learn by touching, they learn by doing, they learn by seeing or hearing.
The teachers always make it fun for us, into games for us.
It's weird to say quizzes are fun, but yeah, he makes them fun.
Good teaching is performance.
Their job is to inspire you to do something with your life.
And I love that blowing their minds.
The goal is to make them better for whatever that's worth.
And that's the biggest reward ever. It's really cool.
You touch one child's life, I mean, that's everything. It's everything.
Okay, so I think Beth and I can hang out for a couple minutes if there's any questions. Otherwise, you are free to go, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.